There we are.
Let's get to it then.
We're recording right now. How long do you think we could do a whole podcast like this?
Oh, I couldn't last very long. Don't have your skills, mate.
I think I could do it. Welcome to the Afterword podcast from Union Church in Livingston County, Michigan. Each week we sit down to think out loud about how the gospel of Jesus Christ and the truths of his word connect to the questions, issues, and practices of everyday life. And today we're talking about 1 Thessalonians and grieving with hope. Hey everybody, welcome to the Afterword podcast. I am Ethan Ezikian, and I'm here with my co-host and co-pastor, Kyle Rodriguez.
Hello.
How are you, sir?
I'm great. Sun's out. That's all I can ask for in the fall.
Yeah, it's been a pretty good fall weather-wise.
Really has.
Few stretches of rain and cold, but we've got some good color too.
Mm-hmm. I can look out the window where we're at right now, and I can just see a few remaining orangish leaves in a blue sky, so I'm not complaining today.
Yeah. Hey, Kyle, I have a quiz for you.
All right.
You ready?
Maybe.
Several questions. The first is, name the food that rich people eat that is snails. Escargot, yes. Okay, great. You're 1 for 1 right now. Second question is, name the thing that is at like airports and shopping malls that you go. They're like moving stairs. You ride up and down.
The uppy-downy machine?
Yeah, the uppy-downy machine, but what's the real name?
An escalator?
Of it? Escalator, yes. Last is maybe the hardest. I'm going to read from a thesaurus, and I want you to tell me the word that all these words are like. Increase, accelerate, expand, rise, swell, intensify. I might say, like in a conflict in the Middle East, one party is going to
escalate.
Escalate, yes. And what do you think all of these words have in common? They all have to do with eschatology, right?
So bad.
That's so bad.
Oh my goodness.
I feel like I'm just blooming into the dad joke era of my life.
Yeah,
really.
We've got 4 kids now.
Yeah. So what is eschatology if it doesn't have anything to do with escalation or escalators or escargot, sir?
Eschatology has to do with the study of last things. That's literally what the word means. You might hear the word the eschaton is that's coming from the Greek word for the last things, and obviously ology, we think of that as the study of something.
Yeah.
So
and that all makes sense, because if I ate escargot, that might be the last thing that I ever eat.
You could talk about how things maybe are going to escalate at the
there you go.
At the end of all things. But so eschatology is literally that's what it means. It means the study of last things, and especially in Christian theology, when we use the term eschatology, we're usually talking about something that falls into a couple different categories. Maybe sometimes we're thinking about what happens after we die. Sometimes we're thinking about when is Christ going to return, and what is that going to look like. You might think about terms like resurrection, new heavens and the new earth, all of that. The millennium, the antichrist, all of those kinds of terms.
The rapture,
yeah. All of those get kind of lumped into this category of, okay, what is going to happen as history comes to a close? What is God bringing all things toward?
Yeah. So the reason I bring up eschatology is because you continued in our series through 1 Thessalonians this last Sunday, and your sermon had a little bit to do with eschatology, and we thought we would dig into that a little bit more today. But before we get into the weeds of some eschatological categories,
and we're going to get into some weeds.
Yeah. But before we do, we should look at the passage and at least read part of it, and then summarize where you took us on Sunday. So would you do that for us?
Yeah, it was a shorter passage. I'll probably just read all of it, but just again to kind of set it up. I think it's really interesting here because Paul sees a very particular practical problem with the Thessalonian church, and he doesn't see a lot of problems with the Thessalonian church. He's overwhelmingly giving them glowing reviews,
very
right?
encouraging.
Yeah, but there is one thing that seems to be happening. It seems that they are grieving very excessively when it comes to some of their friends and family within the church who have died. And Paul, for them, sees their grief, not grief generally as a bad thing, but how they are grieving as not matching up with Christian truth. And so in order to help fix that problem, he gives them some eschatology. He talks about, he wants to inform them about what is going to happen when Christ returns, because that's going to comfort and encourage them and soothe their grief, or at least shape it in some ways. So here's the passage. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. On Sunday, as we looked at this passage, I wanted what I think Paul's primary point here in this passage is, which is to encourage the Thessalonians that their grief would not be the same as a secular, non-Christian grief in the face of death, but that they would have a particularly Christian kind of grief. That's what I wanted to be true of us too as we read this passage. And so our main point on Sunday was that because Christ will return, death's despair is silenced. And we talked about how death is not the end for us because of the hope of resurrection that Paul lays out here. We talked about how death cannot steal joy from us because we always have this day of Christ's return as the culmination of our joy. That's something none of us will miss. And then if we are in Christ, and then finally that death does not separate us because we will be with Christ. That's our great hope, that we will be raised to new life and with Christ and his people forever.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciated about your message was that even as a pastor, most of my opportunity to grapple with death theologically has been at memorial services and funerals. And that's such a deep privilege when I have the opportunities to do that. But most of the time, they're also so charged with, very present grief and emotion. Mm-hmm. And it was good, I felt, for us to consider death a little bit removed from immediate grief and emotion, at least for some of us. At least, for most of us, I know that everybody's bringing their own sorrows with them into a Sunday morning, and we don't know what everybody's going through. But for the church as a whole, to just consider the Christian view of death and last things, sort of apart from the crisis, was just good for our formation. So that we can be better prepared for the day of crisis and the day of sorrow. So I appreciated the way that you shepherded our people this last Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of what we call preaching expositionally, right? Where we're just working our way through a book of the Bible and letting it shape us, and not just reacting moment by moment in our kind of theological formation. Yeah.
So the passage does talk about the Lord descending, the trumpet sounding, the God having the voice of an archangel, the dead rising first. It says that we who are left alive will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in the Latin translation of the Bible, this is where we get the word, this verse in the Latin translation is where we get the word rapture from. So there's a lot of overlap here with, just like we've talked about, eschatology. And this is notoriously an area where Christians love to have strong opinions. And maybe some wacky theories, and you kind of call to mind like images of people with yarn, like strung together, on their bulletin board, and all these different little clippings, and hair unkempt, and like I know when the end is coming. Like, so these are things that for better or for worse, Christians have thought about and debated about, and yet it's also a big, hairy, confusing category of theology.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be interesting and helpful for us to just kind of sort out some eschatological categories within this whole realm of like the study of last things. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to throw out some words out there. Maybe you can help us to like organize them a little bit. So you mentioned some, like people talk about the rapture, which we've mentioned. Mm-hmm. People talk about the millennium. People talk about the resurrection. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you hear the word the tribulation. There are others. How should we think about like different approaches to how Christians have thought about the last thing?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is that this is a complicated subject because the Bible uses a lot of different types of literature to give us a foretaste, a picture, an image of the last things. So sometimes we have something like this passage, which is pretty direct. Paul's just trying to teach these people, hey, here's what's going to happen. This should be a comfort to you. Other times you have, but a lot of the passages that have to do with this in our Bible are not so direct because they're not just somebody teaching in a letter. They are what we would call apocalyptic literature, which utilizes quite a bit of imagery, of symbolism, of metaphor to give a sense of things without necessarily painting a literal picture, right? Mm-hmm. So great example of this would be some of the images and prophecies in Daniel are often associated with the last things. Obviously, the book of Revelation. And then you have this other category of Jesus's prophecies in the Gospels, in Matthew and Mark and Luke, what's often called the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus is giving a picture of what is going to happen, not just at the last things, but leading up to the last days, and giving a lot of sort of apocalyptic pictures in that prophecy as well. So these are complicated because it's hard to understand some of how do you put together the timeline of these prophecies and these apocalyptic pictures? How much of this is meant to be read with a very literal sense? How much of it is meant to be read symbolically? So let's just give you an example, right? If you're reading through the book of Revelation, and you read about the beast that rises up that has 7 heads and however many horns and all this, right? Well, nobody understands the beast to be literal in the sense of a physical monstrosity with 7 heads, right? No,
we don't.
Yeah, sorry, maybe you do.
Man, that's a downer.
That's what I've been waiting for.
I thought all these Godzilla movies were like prophetic.
Yeah. But Christians do disagree on, how literally do we read this? Is this talking about one person or one kingdom or one empire, or is it more symbolic? So those are just some of the
This is an interesting side comment.
Yeah.
Christians talk all the time about we need to read the Bible literally, and I know what people mean by that and agree with them. I have someone who's been influential to me who often said we need to read the Bible literarily,
right?
Knowing the type of literature we're reading so that we can interpret it properly.
Yeah. And that's especially true especially when you're dealing with the categories of prophecy and the categories of apocalyptic literature. So let's go back to some of the labels that you threw out. I think one of the things, kind of like when we went through the baptism conversation as a church, one of the things we have to do is kind of parse out, okay, there's actually multiple different kinds of questions that are being asked here, and sometimes we lump together the answer to one question with the answer to a different question, and so we sort ourselves into camps that maybe are a little bit stereotypical, and we assume too much.
We don't necessarily need to sort ourselves into quite so stark of camps, right?
Especially when it comes to eschatology, that there are a lot of questions. So let's just think about a couple of those questions. One question could be, okay, well, what happens to us after we die, and how do we think of something like heaven in relation to that?
I think of that as like mini eschatology, or like, the end of me.
The end of me. Yeah, there you go. I love that. The end of me. So this relates to our passage today in particular because of the way that Paul uses the word sleep, right? So let's say, okay, what would you say is the most common view of what, just generically across someone who might call themselves a Christian, what happens after we die?
Oh, we go to heaven. and we're with the Lord and with other Christians who've passed. So I think that'd be the most common view.
And I would probably say that heavenly existence is some sort of, I don't know. It's usually
spiritual realm.
Some disembodied. Yeah. There's some pictures
clouds,
in there that we have,
singing.
And then we're just going to be there forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be one view. I would say another view would be that when we die, we sleep. We lose consciousness at some level.
So that might be confusing for some people who have not ever thought in that category before.
Yeah, it's often called soul
jarring.
sleep. Yeah, it's often called soul sleep, and people will often point to this passage and others in the New Testament where the New Testament authors utilize the language of sleep as a euphemism for death. And so these people someone who believes in soul sleep would say, we die, we lose our consciousness essentially, and then we will wake up when we are risen to new life and given new bodies.
Kind of everybody all at once in the new heavens and the new earth.
Mm-hmm. I think both of those answers have some problems with it. I think what's most biblically faithful would be to say, no, when we die, we don't totally lose consciousness. We are in some sense with the Lord. Right, and this would map onto that first view in a lot of ways. Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 1. Paul says to be with Christ would be far better than to be here with you. And he's just talking about life and death. He's worried he's going to die in prison, and he's like, okay, should I die and go be with Christ, or should I stay and have ministry to my fellow believers?
Where Jesus says to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it's described as paradise in a few different ways. Paul also talks about it like that. Jesus gives the parable in Luke chapter 16 about the poor man who dies and goes to what's described as Abraham's side or Abraham's bosom, and the rich man who dies and goes to a place of torment. And both of these people are conscious. They can actually speak to each other in some ways. Yeah. Revelation 6 describes how the slain martyrs are in the throne room of God, and they're there, they're present, they're with the Lord in some sense. And yet, this would be the second part of this view that distinguishes it from probably the common view. This disembodied spiritual presence with the Lord is not where we will be forever. And that's a really important thing for us to grasp onto. These saints in Revelation 6 are crying out to the Lord, and they're saying, how long, O Lord, before you essentially avenge us and rescue the rest of our brothers and sisters who are suffering? So they're crying out for judgment. Romans 8, Paul talks about how both creation and Christians are groaning as they await the redemption of our bodies, as they await the freedom from the corruption of this world. So essentially, the New Testament, I think, paints a pretty clear picture that, on one hand, no, when we die, we don't just lose consciousness. We're with the Lord in some way. You could describe it as paradise. It's heavenly, and yet, ultimately, what we're made for is to be given new bodies, to be risen to life, to be on what Revelation calls the new heavens and the new earth forever and ever and ever. And until that day, there's still a sense of incompleteness, to it.
Yeah, and not to go on a rabbit trail, but the new heavens and the new earth are what they sound like when we will be raised with resurrection bodies as physical beings.
Yeah.
In a redeemed and perfect creation. So it isn't just a spiritual existence that's being painted, which is why the saints in the throne room are waiting and longing, because they weren't made to be disembodied souls.
Right. The final hope for Christians is always in the New Testament: resurrection and Christ's return.
Yeah. So we've got this first category of what happens when we die, type of eschatology. What happens at the end of me and you. And there's three views. We go to heaven and we're with the Lord in perfection in the spiritual existence, or we have soul sleep, or we're with the Lord but waiting for the completion.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay. And you would say that third one is where you land.
Yeah, and I would say that's that's what we will teach as a church. This isn't just something that
that's where I
think
land as well.
I don't think this is unclear. I think that's something that's pretty clear throughout the New Testament. It's not, if somebody held to soul sleep, it would not like bar them from joining our church by any means, but I would want to do some discipleship.
Right. And I think it's the answer that has the most hope.
Yeah.
But it's not something that, if somebody wants to disagree with me on it, I'm going to be like, well, all right, we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can have fellowship with people who would have a different perspective, but I also don't understand why it would be something to argue about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's more when we talk about eschatology, though.
Yeah.
More maybe like, could be tomorrow, but it could also be 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, sort of thing. Like, what's a different category for eschatological subject matter?
Sure. So another category could be to think about, when is Christ going to return, and how does that relate with the resurrection of believers? Right.
Okay.
So, and that's really what this passage is kind of zeroing in on, is this moment when Christ returns and when the Christians are raised to new life. So there's, again, I think you could probably, there's more nuance. There's one other category we could talk about, but I think really you could talk about three categories here. And this also has to do with what's often talked about as the tribulation, right?
Okay.
So the tribulation is usually the word that's describing what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 24 in the Olivet Discourse, and describing time of suffering, a time of judgment of God's wrath upon the world. A lot of people will take a lot of the pictures from Revelation and map it onto this time at the end of history when suffering on earth gets really intense.
Yeah. So I was a church kid growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, and I remember reading a series of books called Left Behind.
Yeah, yeah.
And that told a story about all of a sudden all the Christians in the world were disappeared, and then there was this period of time where the world just went to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
And then Christ came back after that period of time. So this is kind of, whether that story is right or wrong, this is the thing we're talking about, right?
Yeah, kind of. So the question that we're asking here is, okay, the Bible clearly describes suffering and some, in some sense, judgment upon the earth.
Yeah.
Jesus talks about it. Paul talks about it. John talks about it. So how do we understand that period of suffering with when Jesus is going to return and when Christians are going to raise to new life? So it's really a question of timing, this question,
okay.
right? So again, you could think about three categories. First category you could think about, you would call pre-tribulational, right? So the question is, when is Jesus going to return? And the answer is before pre-tribulational.
Okay.
Sort of. This would be when are Christians going to be raised to new life, is really they would be raised before the tribulation. So this is really that kind of left behind perspective. And it would say, okay, Christians are going to be raised and taken out of the world before the tribulation.
Okay.
Then there's going to be this period of, usually a literal period of 7 years of intense suffering and judgment.
And that 7 years comes from somewhere in Revelation?
Actually, I think it originates in Daniel, in some of the Daniel prophecies. But
Okay.
So you've got 7 years of tribulation. There's some difference of opinion of what exactly is happening in those 7 years, but when Revelation talks about the 7 seals and trumpets and whatnot, they're usually mapping those on to those 7 years. And then the question is, okay, well, one of the questions could be, okay, well, can people believe in Jesus during that time? And obviously, if you've read like the Left Behind series, then you would say, yes, more people will come to faith during that time. But this is a view that's actually pretty new. It really has only begun to exist within the last about 200 years. Came along with the rise of what's called dispensationalism.
So just pause real quick here, because that might be pretty surprising for some people to hear. Because if you've grown up in the church, there's a good chance that you would have grown up assuming this was the view, that there wasn't any other view. So let's slow down for a second. You're telling me this view, pre-tribulational view that involves the rapture and 7 years of tribulation, that's a very new view?
Yeah. Thinking about it as the tribulation being this particular 7-year period, and Christians are taken up out of the world beforehand. 7 years, Christ then returns.
Okay.
That is a very new view, which doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it does mean that we should have a lot of caution, I think. Again, it arises with a way of reading the Bible that's usually described as dispensationalism, which also, again, very new, about 200 years ago. And even though this view, like you said, is very popular among American evangelicals in particular, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years, not really anywhere in church history before the 1800s.
Okay. So what are the alternative views?
So alternatively, you could say that you have a post-tribulational view. So this would be to say, okay, yes, there is going to be a period of intense suffering at the end of history, and maybe even literally 7 years also. But Christians aren't just going to disappear from the earth through that tribulation. They are going to be here. The Lord is going to sustain them and save them through it. But then Christ will return after that tribulation. Christians will be raised. The wicked will be judged, and it will all happen in that one moment at the end of all things.
Okay. So truly, speaking out of like not having studied a ton on this particular vein of eschatology, I feel like we're getting closer to what resonates biblically with me.
Yeah.
Christians not escaping from the bad stuff, but enduring with Christ's strength, helping them endure till the end. So I'm just throwing that out there.
And really the third view that we'll talk about at least today, there is a what's called mid-tribulational view, but it's a little more fringe, at least minor. Not a lot of people would ascribe to that. But a third view you could say would be a post-tribulational view, but doesn't necessarily view the descriptions of Jesus in Matthew 24 or the prophecies of Revelation to be just describing 7 years at the end of history, but really seeing them more as typological of what's going to happen all throughout the history of the church, that the church and the world would endure suffering, wars, rumors of wars, natural disasters, all of that, as both a foretaste of God's wrath for the wicked and purifying grace for God's people, that he actually, even through their suffering, the Lord is sanctifying them and preparing them for his return. I think, where I land at the end of the day is I probably kind of a combination of those last two views, which is that, yes, the descriptions that both Jesus and John give are painting a picture of what it looks like just to live in a broken world as a Christian. And there seems to be some sense, at least in the Bible, that things will intensify at the end. I don't know that that's going to be exactly 7 years, but that there will be an intensification of persecution, of suffering before Christ returns. That's where I would land, and I would say, again, that's what we as a church will teach as these things come up.
Right. So just to restate again, in this sort of category of thinking, we're thinking about when Christ returns and where are we in relation to the tribulation, and where is Christ's return in relation to that tribulation. There's this pre-tribulational view that says Christ will kind of come, but only partially to bring Christians up to heaven with him, and there will be a 7-year period of great tribulation where people can come to Christ still. And then when that ends, Christ will come back. But then there's this post-trib view that says it's all going to happen, and then Christ will come, and Christians won't be removed from it. And then there's this, what did we call the third one?
You could call it just like a post-symbolic tribulation or something like that.
Okay, man, so much vocabulary.
I know, here. I'm sorry. Yeah, I told you we're getting in the weeds.
Yeah, okay, so that's that.
So the one thing I would want to say to end all of that would be, sometimes Christians will ask me, right, like, do you believe in a rapture? And I would say, yeah, I believe in a rapture.
Because you believe it insofar as it's here in 1 Thessalonians 4.
Right. 1 Thessalonians 4 says that Christians will be caught up or snatched up into the air. And that's where that word rapture means, right? Christians will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. But I don't believe in a secret rapture where Christians suddenly disappear and nobody knows what happened, because of of the way I read this particular passage in 1 Thessalonians 4 that says Christ returns, his people meet him in the air, and that meeting is not
like
he's
you
taken them
described in
away.
the sermon. It's like a welcome party.
Yeah, they're
to
welcoming him
come
to
back.
earth. And then as you look into 2 Thessalonians, which we'll get into in a few weeks, it seems to pretty clearly describe that both the judgment that comes at Christ's return and the relief that comes for his people all happens at once as he returns. So that's the part of that pre-tribulation view that I don't think puts the biblical pieces together well, is to try and separate Christians' hope of resurrection and meeting their Lord, separate that from the judgment that comes upon the wicked and those who do not receive Christ when he returns.
Yeah.
I think the picture the Bible paints is those are just two sides of the same coin.
Okay. So we don't know Left Behind.
I actually really like the Left Behind books. I think they're fun. I think they're super fun.
But they're not teaching doctrine.
But I think we got to be careful with taking all of our doctrinal cues there.
All right. Are there more eschatological categories that we should talk about?
Well, the other big one that I think will be on people's mind that doesn't have anything to do with this particular passage is the millennium, right?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
So usually when we talk about our eschatological views, we're really just talking about, are you a premillennial? Are you a post-millennial? It's really just about the millennium, which even though this is, again, just one small question in the eschatological buffet. So this is all coming out of Revelation chapter 20, right? In Revelation chapter 20, it describes how an angel comes down, he seizes Satan, he binds him. He's bound. He is bound in
he's banded.
He's imprisoned. He's imprisoned in a bottomless pit for 1,000 years. It talks about how he can no longer deceive the nations, and then it talks about how Christ reigns for 1,000 years with his people. And then that 1,000-year ends, and Satan is released. Everyone is risen for judgment, and Christ then the new heavens and the new earth are kind of consummated after that. So that's just the picture that's given in Revelation 20. Yeah. The question is, well, how does that map onto history, and how literal is it? That's where Christians can disagree. So I think really this is an area where there's a lot more room for interpretation. I have a position, but it's one where, as we talk about these things as a church, I'm going to be much more prone to explain differing perspectives on this, because I think it is a lot less clear. But the three big categories that you could give here would be, again, we're going to keep using these same prefixes: a pre-millennial, a post-millennial, and an millennial. We got a new prefix with the awe.
Millennial.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So a premillennial would say Christ is going to return before the millennium. So this would say, okay, Jesus returns, the Christians are raised to new life, and Jesus is reigning for 1,000 years, in a literal 1,000-year period on the earth.
And then what happens after the 1,000 years, according to this view?
According to this view, after the 1,000 years, then Satan is released in some sense, and there's some sort of rebellion against Jesus. There is some sort of battle, whether that's physical or spiritual, is hard to unpack. But and Christ then fully conquers all of his enemies. That's when the great judgment would happen, and kind of the final verdict would be given on everybody who has ever lived.
So you and I could live out our Lord of the Rings fantasies in that.
Yes, yeah.
We get to be a part of the army, fight the forces of darkness.
Do you think that battle will be fought with bows and arrows, or tanks and missiles? That's the real
definitely
question.
think swords and bows and arrows.
Somehow in that 1,000-year reign, we have to technologically step back.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's not going to feel right.
Oh gosh. Okay, so there's the
Maybe
premillennial view.
We could go Star Wars. We could go lightsabers.
But with Christianity and not vague Eastern mysticism.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be premillennial. Christ returns, then there's a literal 1,000 years on earth where Jesus and his people reign.
Okay.
Before the great judgment. Postmillennial would be the second view, and postmillennial would be, again, the labels have to do with when is Jesus going to come back, and so the postmillennial would say Jesus returns.
And when is the 1,000 years of his reign? Right?
Yeah. So Jesus is going to return after the millennium. Post
millennial. Gotcha.
So this view would say the millennium isn't it is something that happens as Christianity spreads throughout the earth and as Christianity influences all societies. So it would be you could almost describe it as an optimistic view of history, saying that because of the powerful work of the Holy Spirit through the church, eventually all of the world will get to a place where it is essentially Christianized. And Christianity has had such an influence on societies that we get into a sort of utopian place. This view would have to do largely with something like the prophecy in Daniel, where you see the mountain rolls, collapses, and you see the river spread all throughout the earth, and they would see this as a symbol for the church and for Christianity. Okay. And I'm probably butchering that vision, but so this would say, okay, we're going to have, it might be a literal 1,000 years, the 1,000 years might be symbolic, but it's going to be a period at the end of history that comes about because of the Lord's work through the church to transform all of the world. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, Christ will come back. The devil will be in some sense loosened. There will be, again, kind of final battle, final judgment all happen.
Yeah. So forgive me, this is too far in the weeds, but do postmillennials tend to believe that the millennium has begun?
There's probably some diversity on that. I don't think... Yeah, there's definitely some diversity on that.
Okay.
So some postmillennials would say, yes, that has begun, but it hasn't reached anywhere near its consummation.
Okay.
But I think most would say, at least most that I've encountered, would say the millennium. We're not yet in the millennium.
But in this view, the kingdom of God spreads and spreads and spreads. The world gets better and better and better until finally Christ comes back.
Yeah. And that, again, the Revelation chapter 20, when it talks about how the devil is bound and he can no longer deceive the nations, that's going to be realized as the whole world is Christianized in some sense.
Okay. So then there's this amillennial, this new prefix. Where are they at?
So in the prefix means none or no, right? It's
no millennium.
Yeah. But the amillennial view doesn't really mean that there is no millennium. The amillennial view would say the millennium isn't a physical reign on earth that happens, that you can see this perfect 1,000 years of utopia on earth. What is being described in Revelation in this view is what the saints are experiencing in heaven right now as Jesus reigns from his heavenly throne. That Satan is bound right now. That doesn't mean he can't do anything, but that his work is very limited because Christ has essentially defeated him on the cross and in his resurrection. And so the amillennials would generally read Revelation much more sort of symbolically and cyclically, rather than reading Revelation as a description of literal events that are happening in a confined period at the end of time. It's more, it's picturing all of history in some senses.
Okay, so when you say cyclically, you're saying like some of these disasters that are described in Revelation are not necessarily one historical event that needs to be fulfilled, but more just like things like this are going to happen and happen and happen again until Christ comes back.
Yeah, and there's a lot more we could get into in terms of how you read Revelation. That obviously has to do with all of these questions in some sense. But again, this amillennial view would say what's being described here is Jesus's heavenly reign, which is happening right now. This 1,000 years is a metaphor for a long time. It's not a literal 1,000 years, but Jesus is reigning over the earth as the victorious king right now. His people are reigning with him spiritually, but his physical return on earth is going to happen at the end of history. And again, you're going to see that final conquering of his enemies and the great judgment of all peoples.
Okay. Well, there's lots more that we could talk about here.
Yeah.
And so many rabbit trails.
I know we're already long.
We are, but just to recap, so we would say like pre-millennial, post-millennial, amillennial. There's room for disagreement and yet to still be faithful here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We have teachers who we admire in probably every one of those camps.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
If you want to get really into the weeds on this, there's an old YouTube video you could search. It's called an search in YouTube An Evening of Eschatology, and it was originally from the Desiring God Ministries. It does get very nerdy.
It's really good, though.
But some pastors all sitting around a table debating these issues, and it's fun. It's definitely over an hour. Maybe it's a couple hours long. But you would land where on those three?
In the millennium views, I would land as an all-millennial. I think you would too.
Yes, I would. Yeah. Okay, like I said, so much we could talk about, but we should say, what if you don't agree with us on any of these issues?
Yeah, I think all of these questions kind of tried a little bit as we were going to unpack. Some of them are, I think, less clear in Scripture than others. None of these things that we've talked about today, though, at least these specific questions, are something that's in our statement of faith. And that's really intentional. What's critical for Christians to believe as we think about the end times is we will be given new bodies. And that's a key part of our hope.
Yeah.
Like if you miss that in the New Testament, you're missing something huge, right? It's not just being raised to a disembodied state for eternity. It's physical. That Christ is going to return, that with his return will be unimaginable joy for Christians and real judgment for those who reject Christ. And that all things ultimately are going to be accomplished through Christ and his work, not simply by our efforts. That would be another piece of it that I would think about. But as we try and work out the rest of these things, this is something that we do together as the church to try and sharpen one another, to try and clarify our hope. And we don't want to be dogmatic about it, although we do want to disciple one another towards what I would say is a faithful hermeneutic. How do we read the Bible well? That's really the kind of the underlying question as we try and work these things out. Mm-hmm. And I think some of these things, like we talked about, especially when you get to these millennial views, you can read the Bible well and faithfully and land in any of those three views.
Yeah.
I don't think you can read the Bible very well and get to a soul sleep kind of view. Right. So trying to kind of work that out together. Okay. It's like even if we don't want to be dogmatic, what makes the most sense as we read the Bible faithfully? Those are skills that we just have to build with one another.
Yeah. And when we talk about having gospel culture and being able to approach one another with charity around theological issues, what we never mean that we want people to shove their opinions under the rug.
Yeah.
We want to be able to engage with one another openly and, good-heartedly. But we also don't mean that we want people to feel free to come and make this their one rah issue that they're just going to bring up. No, hey, we're going to talk about John 3:16 today, and eventually we'll get to the millennium. But we want to weigh these opinions and theological debates appropriately. And as we think about theological triage, opinions about eschatology would generally fall in that kind of third tier, not keeping us from fellowship together in the church.
Yeah, and like you said, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them. I think we should. So if you disagree with something and you want to talk about why, I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation.
It's not going to be the bar that we force each other to meet in order to have fellowship with one another.
Okay, so we've kind of scratched the itches of everybody who wants to be a Bible and theology nerd around eschatology, but there are a couple important questions that I do think we should spend some time on. Kyle, if Paul was aiming to comfort Christians in Thessalonica about believers who had died, and if this passage should comfort us in those same situations, how should we think about people who are not believers who die? What does it mean to grieve with hope, like the passage is telling us to do, as a Christian in that sort of situation?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think that's, at least in my experience as a pastor and just as a Christian, that's the situation that most Christians have the hardest time with.
Yeah.
If their grandfather loved the Lord for their whole life and died at a ripe old age, they can celebrate that he's with Jesus now.
Yeah.
But if their family member who did not know the Lord and had rejected the gospel dies, that's a lot harder to grapple with.
Yeah. Those are the hardest funerals, for sure.
I think with this question, there's really kind of two things that we have to keep in mind, right? On one hand, this hope that Paul is giving us should be a real contrast with the lack of hope for those who do not know Christ. And we have to hold that contrast seriously. Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those without hope. So he's implying that those who are without Christ, they don't have hope in death. And that should give us a sense of urgency and a sense of grief. We need to hold that truth with weight, that for those who are not in Christ, who do not believe the gospel and grasp their salvation by faith, there isn't hope for them beyond death.
Yeah. Paul talks just immediately after this about being very sober in the face of all this. This is incredibly sobering.
Yeah. Yeah. And it should be. So yeah, I think on one hand, it should be a very sobering thing. That doesn't mean we don't have hope, but it does mean that we have a sober, realistic view. Yeah. And that should prompt us towards evangelism, discipleship, even just grief in our prayers as we plead with the Lord to save. We need to hold that with some weight. And yet, on the other hand, the other thing that I think we need to hold on to is that as Christians, Paul is trying to give this church and these people a sense of just a taste, a taste of the unimaginable joy that will come on the day when they see Jesus face to face. And I think sometimes people underestimate the wisdom and goodness of God. If we are tempted to believe, if my loved one isn't there, I won't be able to enjoy heaven or the resurrection.
Yeah.
If we're tempted to believe that, then I really do think we have misunderstood and underestimated the goodness of Jesus and the goodness of God.
Yeah.
Our hope in the resurrection is not ultimately to be reunited with loved ones. Our hope in the resurrection and being in the new heavens and the new earth is what Paul says here in 1 Thessalonians 4. We will be with him forever. And so I know it can be hard for us to imagine, how can both of these things be true? How can I not be with a loved one forever and yet be eternally happy forever? That's hard to hold both of those two things in tension. But if we really believe that God is good and that he is wise and that everything wrong is going to be made right on that day, not by our wisdom, but by his, then we can hold fast to the truth that we will see him, we will be made like him, and we will be with him forever. And that will be joyful, even if I don't know exactly how that fits with my grief over those who have not been saved.
I think some of the error that we can fall into when we start to think about this, and especially thinking about God's character in all this, is we think about his wisdom and understanding and goodness and power like we think about our own. We just think about like, oh, God has those things like us, only a lot more. And I think it is helpful to realize it's like, it's not like we will get to heaven and somebody will bring out that Men in Black stick and just like erase our memories and just shove away everything that we don't agree with God. And so then we'll just be like memory erased robots that are happy for the rest of eternity. Somehow, in a way that is outside of our comprehension, God is going to make it so that all things align.
Yeah.
Everything that is present in our life and in our memory and in our experience will align in such a way that we will see his goodness and wisdom, and we will be joyful.
Yeah.
And because we often think about God as just a bigger version of ourselves, we think, well, there's no way that God could be both good and wise and powerful and allow someone to die in unbelief. But we just don't understand the categories of God's wisdom and goodness. And it will, I mean, this is faith that we will have joy and everything will be in alignment under Christ. And yeah.
This is really, I mean, this is the same question that Paul is grappling with in Romans 9 through 11. He's grappling with, I have friends and family members, my countrymen, these Jewish men and women who are rejecting Christ. And I'm grieved. And I feel so strongly that I almost wish that I could be accursed and sent to hell so that they would be saved.
Yeah.
And
God is sovereign over all of it.
And that's where he lands, is that the Lord has both the right in his goodness and his justice to punish the wicked, and that ultimately, this is how he ends this whole discourse. He just gets to this point, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God.
Yeah.
How unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways.
Yeah.
That all where he can land is, God is so much bigger than me. He's so much better than me. He is so good. To him be glory forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
And that's where we just have to rest.
We have such a fallen instinct that like somehow we're gonna uncover, we're gonna like get to that place and uncover like God's been scheming this whole time and he's not really good or something like that. But it is that's not the Christian story. Mm-hmm. I read all these fantasy novels, and some of them will like have conceptions of deity in them, and the only way that human authors can write gods is that they're flawed, like some version of like the Greek gods, like these flawed beings that are just more powerful than us. But that's not the God we're talking about, and that's not the Christian story. Mm-hmm. It's a better story than that. Mm-hmm.
And I think one impulse that Christians can have to try and reconcile these tensions is to get into you try and work around it with a sort of universalist position where it's like, well, God, if he's good, he must save everybody in the end. Or maybe there's some kind of purgatory where people can work out their sin and then eventually be saved. And I think,
or annihilationism,
where it's like, well, they're not going to suffer forever. They're just gonna disappear. And on one level, there's a part of me that's like, well, you know what? The Lord could do something that I don't expect.
God is God.
He's God. So if I get to heaven and the Lord says, yeah, actually, there is going to be a way for all these people to be redeemed. It's like, well, great. Look at the mercy of God. But that's not what the Bible is trying to disciple us toward. Yeah. The Bible is trying to get us to grapple with the weight of judgment for those who reject their only hope of forgiveness of sin. Mm-hmm. And if we're trying to lessen that burden, lessen that weight by having some sort of sanctified imagination of how the Lord may someday save all peoples, we're skirting around what the Bible is trying to get us to confront.
Yeah. So maybe to land the plane here, Kyle, there's so many ways that the enemy can, we will encounter grief in our life. And there's so many ways that the enemy can use those seasons of grief to tell us lies. What is one thing you would say to a grieving Christian to anchor them in the truth? You go first and then I'll go.
Can I say two things?
Yes, I'll allow it.
All right. First thing I would say is about the devil's tactics. I think I've said this before on the podcast, and I've said it a lot to people recently, I feel like, but I think the devil is generally always trying to get us to either doubt, despair, or be distracted. Doubt, despair, and distraction are his primary aims for us, because in all of those things we get pulled away from the Lord, whether it's pulled away from believing and from salvation, or just being pulled away as a Christian from experiencing the benefits of salvation, right? Yeah. And so in grief, I think you can pretty easily see how any of those three can apply during a season of grief, where the evil of the world causes you to doubt the goodness of God, or it causes you to be dragged into the depths of despair to where you have a hard time believing, have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, or you just want to distract yourself from the pain, and you end up drifting away from the Lord in your distraction. Doubt, despair, and distraction are all very easy temptations for us in grief, and that's what the devil wants for you. The second thing that I would say is that the good news of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection is that he has been through death. He has experienced death just as much, maybe even more, than any other human being ever has. So he knows what it's like. And his resurrection means that there is hope after death. When we talk about being united with Christ, we mean Christ has experienced the worst of what we could ever experience on our behalf. He can sympathize with us in that. And the best that is to come that he has experienced is assured for us. So no matter how difficult your season of grief may be, Christ has been there in the grief, and he right now is in the joy that is secure for you, even through the hard right now. Yeah,
that's really good. Maybe the one thing that I would say in terms of lies that we can believe when we encounter grief is that when Paul says, I don't want you to grieve like those who have no hope, he's not saying, I don't want you to grieve.
Yeah, really good.
That Christians have permission in the scriptures to grieve with the Lord, before the Lord. We grieve with hope, but we can still be sad. The Bible calls death the last enemy. And it is an enemy. We can hate death. And so the Psalms are full of examples of grief that is directed like grief with the Lord, grief before the Lord, grief before the face of God kind of thing. And so we can be like, not every, this is maybe nitpicky, not every Christian funeral has to be a celebration of life. I'm not going to nitpick if you want to call your loved one's memorial service a celebration of life, but some, I think we would do well to have sad funerals, to acknowledge death as an enemy, and this is not how it should be. I think that's a Christian thing to do, and to hope
and have hope in
the resurrection. So much more that could be said in almost every facet of this podcast, but I think that's a good place to leave it for today. The goal of this podcast is to equip the people of Union Church for discipleship and mission. If you're a Christian listening in from another context, we're grateful that you've joined us, and we pray that this conversation might help you to follow Jesus and engage in his mission where he has placed you. We would love to hear from you, so if you have thoughts or feedback or questions, you can send an email to connect@unionchurchmi.com and include the word podcast in your email subject line. Thanks for listening, and Lord willing, we'll see you someday soon on another episode of the Afterword podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Afterword podcast. My name is Larry. No.
Larry the Cucumber.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow, Bob. What should we learn about Jesus this week, Bob?
I love my lips.
You gotta work on that one.
Yeah, I do.